Hello and welcome into another episode of Locked On Wolves. Today on the show, we're going to talk all about how Shake Milton will be replacing the production and really the roles of both Jaylen Nowell and Jordan McLaughlin in the Wolves rotation. Yes, J-Mac is still on the team, but I think Milton's effectively replacing his role in the rotation. We'll also talk about ESPN's latest offseason power rankings. It's all coming to the show. Welcome in. You are Locked On Wolves.
You are Locked On Timberwolves, your daily Minnesota Timberwolves podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day.
Hello and welcome to the Locked On Wolves podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. My name is Ben Beecken. I'm the host of Locked On Wolves. Today's episode is brought to us by our friends at FanDuel Sportsbook, official sportsbook of Locked On. Make every moment more. Visit FanDuel.com/LockedOn today to get started. Happy Wednesday, everybody. Happy Hump Day. And a big thank you for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every day. Of course, this show is free and available everywhere, including YouTube, as well as all of your favorite audio platforms, wherever you like to listen to podcasts. You can find Locked On Wolves. You can also watch on the Locked On Sports Minnesota app, which can be found on both Roku and Amazon Fire TV. This show, along with all the other Minnesota podcasts at Locked On, are available there. More great local sports coverage 24/7, and it's free. Of course, the midst of an exciting baseball season, the Twins still in first place. The midst of the offseason for hockey, but also football starting up. So both the Golden Gophers Locked On show and Locked On Vikings are where you need to be to get all your football info here as we lead into training camp and the start of the season for both. Again, download the Locked On Sports Minnesota app today on both Roku and Amazon Fire TV. All right. You can also follow on Twitter. Got to put that in there too, at Locked On T Wolves, and also at my account, which is at Beecken. And that's with two B's, two E's, CKEN. All right. On Tuesday's show, I spent much of the program talking about how Troy Brown Jr. and Nickeil Alexander-Walker would effectively be replacing Taurean Prince and what his role was. Of course, Alexander-Walker, the Wolves acquired at the deadline last year, but it's his first full season in Minnesota, and they also had to re-sign him. So I would include him in this conversation as a quote-unquote newcomer in a sense. At least his role will be new, right? Because last year he didn't really have one. He was in and out of the lineup a little bit until McDaniels got hurt in the final game of the regular season. And then his role became a lot more cemented at that point. But the argument I made Tuesday, I won't rehash the whole thing because hopefully you listened to Tuesday's show already, is that the Wolves essentially out are Taurean Prince, Jaylen Nowell, and, Jordan McLaughlin. I put that in air quotes because he's still on the roster, but I think he's out of the top 10, 10-man rotation, if you will. In our Nickeil Alexander-Walker, in quotes, because he was on the team, but not for the whole season, plus Shake Milton and Troy Brown Jr. So I talked on Tuesday about how effectively Taurean Prince is being replaced by Brown and Alexander-Walker in terms of both positionally, because it's kind of the role Alexander-Walker will play. I think from the beginning is kind of that bigger three type role, even though he's a 2-3, he's not a 3-4. None of these guys are really power forwards, right? But that's because the Wolves paid a bunch of money to Naz Reid, and they still have Kyle Anderson. So Prince actually played mostly the three last year anyway because of both Naz Reid and Kyle Anderson. So that's effectively what we're doing here is replacing Prince with Alexander-Walker. Brown and Shake Milton are kind of both two guards, right? So what we're doing today is we're going to examine Nowell and McLaughlin both exiting the rotation and why in my mind, I think of Shake Milton as kind of replacing both of them in a sense. Now, part of this is because McLaughlin missed a huge chunk of games last year anyway, so he wasn't in the rotation. But when the season started, he was the backup point guard and Jaylen Nowell was the backup shooting guard, and that was kind of the way things were going to roll until McLaughlin got hurt, and then it ended up being more Jaylen Nowell and more Anthony Edwards running the second unit, and then eventually a little bit of Alexander-Walker, a little bit of Taurean Prince. It was just kind of a rotating cast of characters, and of course Nowell dealt with some injuries the second part of the season too. But we'll dig into like the numbers and why I try and kind of back up my theory with the numbers. But I think what the Wolves are doing is they said, look, we got a taste of a high usage bench guard running our second unit and getting his when he wanted and trying to be that microwave scorer off the bench in Jaylen Nowell. And it last year it didn't result in anything positive. 2 years ago, yes, he was very good off the bench. Last year, the shooting efficiency was down, and we'll get into the numbers again, but it just wasn't as good of a season for Jaylen Nowell. And the Wolves bench unit really struggled. Even though he scored, it was more volume scoring than anything else, and he didn't create for anyone else. So it ended up just being Jaylen Nowell, hey, go out there and try and get hot, or it was plugging Anthony Edwards back into the game, subbing him out with most of the starters on the floor, having the bench unit give him 2 or 3 minutes each half where Jaylen Nowell's kind of running the show, and then it's plug Ant back in and have him try and steady the ship with the reserves. I actually think that's kind of the plan going into the season, but instead of 2 or 3 high usage minutes with Jaylen Nowell, it's let's use 2 or 3 minutes of Shake Milton kind of running the show where he can also create for others. And then also he'll play better off the ball with Anthony Edwards. He's a better off-ball player. Nowell was never really effective without the ball in his hands. He had to be attacking, and he was actually pretty good at creating for himself. Even last year, most of the numbers will bear that out, but he didn't do much for anybody else. It wasn't generating easy shots for teammates, whereas Shake Milton's a little better at that and will be better playing off the ball when Anthony Edwards is the one that's given the keys to that reserve unit. It'll basically be Ant plus whichever mix and match of reserve wings and guards Chris Finch has on the floor at the time. Now, a lot of the time, the Wolves will be staggering Karl-Anthony Towns and Rudy anyway. So it'll either be Towns or Gobert at center, most likely, potentially Nas at the 4, and then some combination of Shake Milton, Troy Brown Jr., and Nickeil Alexander-Walker, 2 of those 3 with Anthony Edwards. And that's going to kind of be what we see a lot of, I think, off the bench. And actually throw Kyle Anderson in there too. Potentially it's Nas at the 5 and Kyle Anderson at the 4, right? The Wolves have a lot of guys that they got to try and find minutes for this season. So I want to dig into, again, the numbers at B-Ball Index specific to Shake Milton versus Jaylen Nowell and Jordan McLaughlin, and kind of break down the areas in which the Wolves are improving. And then I want to spend a little bit more time on Thursday's show of kind of combining what I'm doing today and what I did yesterday on Tuesday's show, which is what are the things the Wolves are chasing? What are the qualities in these newcomers in Shake Milton, Troy Brown Jr., and Nickeil Alexander-Walker that the Wolves were clearly going after with these acquisitions? There's a few things that if you listen to both these shows, they'll stand out to you, but I'm going to kind of tie a bow on it on Thursday's show. So that's the plan here for the next couple of days. But today, let's get into Shake versus Nowell and McLaughlin. We're going to do that here next. Today's episode of Locked On Wolves is brought to us by our friends over at FanDuel. Take your first swing at betting MLB on FanDuel. Get 10 times your first bet amount in bonus bets up to $200. That's right. Just bet $20 and you'll land $200 in bonus bets, win or lose. That's $200 that you can spend betting everything from the money line to the over-under to who you think might hit the first home run in any given game. All that is on an app that's safe, secure, and super easy to use. Plus, when you win, you can get paid instantly. It's the height of baseball season. We're not quite yet to the dog days of summer. The Twins are still in first place in the American League Central. So if you are a Minnesota baseball fan, it's a good time to get involved at FanDuel. And also, we're on the cusp of football starting. Training camps are underway this week for, I believe, every team. Preseason starts in like 10 days or something like that. So there's plenty of football to bet as well. But of course, there's no better place to bet on MLB than FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Sign up today and visit FanDuel.com/lockedon to get up to $200 in bonus bets. That's FanDuel.com/lockedon. FanDuel, official partner of Major League Baseball. All right, so taking a look at the B-Ball Index profiles. Again, it's bball-index.com. It's a subscription service that does a bunch of different things, including aggregating advanced stats from other sites. They have proprietary stats, a lot of proprietary stuff, including catch-alls and really in the weed stats. So we spent some time on Tuesday talking about several things that Troy Brown Jr. and Nickeil Alexander-Walker do better than Taurean Prince that maybe you wouldn't have expected. And including Troy Brown Jr. being a better all-around three-point shooter based on the numbers than Taurean Prince, which we talked about this with Locked On Lakers last Friday. Is it real? Is it not? Because last year was a career best shooting year for Troy Brown Jr. That's a conversation we covered then, and we'll probably be asking ourselves quite a bit early in the season. What are are the Wolves counting on this? But anyway, that's one example of something that was uncovered here at B-Ball Index. So let's go. There's kind of these 8 major categories that they lead with on all their profiles. And we're going to go through those categories quick, and I'll point out where some of the differences are. And I was actually a little bit surprised. I was expecting Jaylen Nowell's numbers to not be quite as favorable as they were. So the first one is 3-point shooting. Shake Milton gets a B in 3-point shooting. Jaylen Nowell a B-, and Jordan McLaughlin has a C. Finishing, Jaylen Nowell's an A, Shake Milton's an A-. Jordan McLaughlin's a C+. Playmaking, both Shake Milton and Jaylen Nowell got a B. Jordan McLaughlin an A-. Perimeter isolation defense, D's for both Shake Milton and Jaylen Nowell. Not surprising, and I'll dig a bit more into that here in a minute. Offensive rebounding doesn't matter as much for this role, but Shake has a C, Nowell a D. Defensive rebound, and McLaughlin an F. Defensive rebounding, a C+ for Nowell, whereas Shake has a C, and so does Jordan McLaughlin. Offensive impact, this was interesting to me. Jaylen Nowell got an A- in offensive impact last year, according to B-Ball Index. Shake only got a B. And then defensive impact, they're both an F, and Jordan McLaughlin's a B. Let's talk about defense first, because I don't think it'll take a whole lot of time to discuss. Neither are good defenders. In fact, at ESPN, their real plus-minus stat, which it's my favorite kind of catch-all, if you will, but obviously should not be taken as gospel, and context matters, all of those things. So, disclaimers. But in defensive real plus-minus, 96 shooting guards last season. Malik Monk was 96th, the worst one. 95th was Jaylen Nowell, the second worst among shooting guards, according to ESPN defensive real plus-minus. Shake Milton was 82nd. He was only 13 spots higher. Now, the difference in the value is very different. Shake's was a minus 3.99, whereas Jaylen was minus 6.16. So that's like 2.25 points worse almost in terms of the real plus-minus value. So all that to say, I still think it's notable, but they're both bad. Incidentally, Austin Rivers was at 87th with a minus 4.2, so worse than Shake and only slightly better than Jaylen Nowell. So that's another topic. I don't want to dig too much into that today, but Austin Rivers is effectively this team's 11th man last year. And if you're bumping Jordan McLaughlin from 10 to 11, or you're putting, say, Josh Minnett's your 11th guy or whatever, when it's all said and done, like plugging any of these guys in instead of Austin Rivers. Remember, he was essentially like the 4th or 5th option to guard point of attack. Like if McDaniels, Anthony Edwards, and I guess later the season, Alexander Walker or Taurean Prince weren't available or whatever, or if when McLaughlin was hurt and the Wolves needed a defender on a tough guard, it was Austin Rivers being asked to do it. And there was a time and a place when Austin Rivers was a good perimeter defender. That time and place is not 2023. So, that's another place. Again, these improvements on the margins. We'll talk about ESPN's power rankings here at the end of the show. I think a lot of times these improvements on the margins get completely overlooked in the offseason. And of course, we don't know exactly how they'll play out. Things change year to year. But this is another example of like Shake Milton isn't a good defender, but he's marginally better than Jaylen Nowell and Austin Rivers, right? That's not why the Wolves acquired Shake Milton. It wasn't because he's a good defender. He's not, but he's marginally better than Jaylen Nowell. And they didn't acquire him because he's marginally better either, but it's a bonus, right? So I think it's important to point that out, that while they're both poor defenders, and specifically Jaylen Nowell, but also include Austin Rivers in the conversation, Shake Milton's marginally better. Shooting is where I want to spend the majority of my time. Because on its face, you'd say, okay, well, Jaylen Nowell had a really poor shooting season. He was like 29%, actually a little below that outside the arc. This coming off of a really solid year before. I mean, remember 2 years ago, Jaylen Nowell was 39.4% for three. Last year was 28.9. Shake was actually had, I think, like a career worst year from three last year. It was around 35-ish% or something like that. Actually, well, here, I have it right here. So that was an area where I was expecting the impact to be much greater, according to Basketball Index, B-Ball Index. Shake was 37.8% last year. But Nowell actually, his numbers looked much better than I was expecting. And it's primarily because of his ability to create his own shot from outside the arc. The actual results weren't anywhere near what Shake Milton did. And here's another theme that you would have seen Tuesday, and we'll talk more about it Thursday, and we'll talk about why. Above the break shooting three-pointers. Jaylen Nowell was 30.9% above the break, which is 45th percentile. So call it 31%. That's a C- at B-Ball Index for shooting threes. If you're not familiar with that term, it's essentially where the notch is, where it goes from a quarter three-point shot to a non-quarter three-point shot. Above the break, Jaylen Nowell was 31%, 45th percentile from outside the arc. Shake Milton last year, 41.9%, call it 42%. So 11 points better than Jaylen Nowell. 31%, Jaylen Nowell above the break, 42% Shake Milton. That's 92nd percentile. That's an A. He was in the 92nd percentile across the entire NBA in shooting threes above the break. We talked about this related to Nickeil Alexander-Walker yesterday on Tuesday's show, and also Troy Brown Jr. Both of them are very good above the break, surprisingly so, especially Nickeil Alexander-Walker. And again, we'll get more to that Tuesday. We'll talk about why, but Prince was not good above the break. Neither was Jaylen Nowell. So this is another example of, like, if you just look at a box score and you say, okay, well, this guy's a better shooter than that guy, so that's why they're doing this. Or, just on its face, a move that might not make sense. It's because the Wolves front office and coaching staff, and every team's front office and coaching staff, they go a layer or two or three or four deeper. It's not simply in a vacuum, right? Because you could say in a vacuum, Jaylen Nowell is a better on-ball scorer. Sure. But who's the better actual fit? And even the B-Ball Index numbers would say that. Like, what was the one I just mentioned? The overall offensive impact actually says Jaylen Nowell had a better grade than Shake Milton. But which player fits the Wolves' needs more? And in the case of Shake Milton, he's a better above the break three-point shooter. And that's a better fit for the Wolves. He's a better creator for others. We'll get into that in a second. That's a better fit for the Wolves than Jaylen Nowell. They decided they didn't need that high usage bench scorer because he's a very specific acquired taste, if you will. The Wolves have a couple guys that create their own shot, a couple few guys. But I mean, between Anthony Edwards and Karl-Anthony Towns, you're usually going to have one of them on the floor. So you don't need another player who's far less efficient saying, like, okay, I'm going to take this game over and score. That's not what you need. You need somebody who can orchestrate an offense and fit an off-ball role when Ant is dominating the ball. And Shake Milton is that guy. He's a better above-the-break three-point shooter than Jaylen Nowell. Catch and shoot. Shake Milton last year, 40% catch and shoot. That's 76th percentile. Jaylen Nowell, 28.3%, 24th percentile. So a far better catch and shoot player Shake Milton is versus Jaylen Nowell. So right there's all your off-ball stuff. All that packaged up, just the above-the-break shooting and the catch-and-shoot threes. That's what the Wolves want out of this role, is a guy that can play off the ball. He can also, and we'll talk about the on-ball stuff in a second, because I do think Shake Milton he essentially ran point guard for chunks of his time in Philadelphia, and I think he'll do that for portions of his time in Minnesota. So we'll talk about that in a second, but just the off-ball stuff is so important. The Wolves aren't going to ask Shake Milton to do a whole ton other than catch and shoot and initiate some offense, but he can also create for himself. The finishing at the rim is actually in the same neighborhood as Jaylen Nowell. Rim shot creation, 84th percentile, that's an A-. Percent at the rim unassisted, 83rd percentile, that's an A-. Drives per 75 possessions, 86th percentile, that's an A-. So a lot of really positive numbers in terms of getting to the basket and finishing at the basket. And Nowell's numbers are good there too. But just the fact that Shake is able to do that, but he's also able to play the off-ball role in a far better way than Jaylen Nowell. I think all of that is extremely important. All right, I do want to get to some on-ball stuff. I think there's a really important stat over at B-Ball Index called true usage, and that to me was a little bit illuminating, and how Shake Milton will fit in the fabric of the Wolves bench and the team, the roster overall, much better than Jaylen Nowell. We'll close with a quick thought on ESPN's latest power rankings, and that'll be today's show. All right, one thought real quick that I missed regarding defense is ball screen navigation, that's another area that Shake Milton was better at last season than Jaylen Nowell. Even though they were both poor defenders, his ball screen navigation, 80th percentile, that's a B plus. And Jaylen Nowell was 74th percentile. It's a B. So not significantly better, but that's another theme we'll talk about Thursday. That's clear that the Wolves are adding guys who are better at navigating ball screens, essentially at the top of the floor, and just kind of being a pest defensively, because the Wolves at times last year did a really poor job with ball pressure. So we'll talk more about that Thursday, but I wanted to point that out. The last thing related to offense is that true usage mark. So I talk a lot about usage rate on the show. It's now a pretty mainstream way to describe. It's essentially, well, it's exactly what it sounds like, right? It's how many possessions a player uses. So if you're finishing the possession in a shot, a free throw attempt, that's essentially, that's what it is, right? Like the possession, how did the possession end and who is responsible for it, right? It could be, turnovers are included in there. So your better players and your scorers are going to have high usage rates. For instance, Jaylen Nowell last year had a 25% usage rate, which is very high for, well, really anybody, but especially for somebody that had a difficult season in terms of offensive efficiency. So like here, real quick for context, let me just pull usage rate leaders for the Wolves. Anthony Edwards had a 29.9% usage rate. Towns was 25.6. Jaylen Nowell was 25%. So he was third on the Wolves in usage rate last season. And Shake Milton's usage rate is obviously much lower, right? Because he basically ran point guard. He was on a team that had a lot of guys that needed the ball in their hands, right? But this is just another example of why he's a better fit for the Wolves than Jaylen Nowell. But his usage rate last year was 18.5%. So still fairly high for a bench guard. But that was like slightly higher than, like, comparing it to Wolves players, slightly higher than Mike Conley, slightly higher than Nickeil Alexander-Walker, but below, D'Angelo Russell, Naz Reid, right? So that's about right. But true usage rate, which I think is really fascinating, tells a little bit of a different story. And essentially what true usage rate does is it also takes into account assists and hockey assists and basically the flow of the offense. There's a full explanation actually over at Nylon Calculus. Well, I think technically it was still fan-sided at the time. This is an article by Seth Partnow, who ran basketball research for the Bucks for several years, and I've referenced some of his stuff before. He writes for The Athletic now. But he invented this true usage mark that was pulled by B-Ball Index. And essentially what it's trying to do is it's trying to pull together all the shots that one creates for themselves, more of a traditional usage rate, but also for others, by pulling in that portion. Like, are you creating shots for others too? And it includes hockey assists, the pass that leads to the assist that leads to the basket. It incorporates overall involvement in offense. And Jaylen Nowell last year had a 7.4% usage rate, true usage rate, 7.4% true usage rate, despite a usage rate of 25%. Shake Milton had an overall offensive usage rate that's like 7 points lower, but his true usage was higher than Jaylen Nowell's. It was a 7.85% compared to Nowell's 7.4%. This is essentially the case in point of why the Wolves wanted to do this. Shake Milton is a better, and I don't say this as a slight to Jaylen Nowell, he's a better team basketball player in the sense that he can create more for others and be a seamless part of a machine in a better way than Jaylen Nowell. I mean, look at how Chris Finch wants to play, right? Chris Finch talks all the time about playing with bumpers and guardrails and just like playing within the system and letting the guys go and operate out of these loose sets and just kind of figure it out. Well, Jaylen Nowell's figuring it out was usually just running pick and roll and either scoring for himself or kicking to a teammate. And at times it was effective, especially 2 years ago. But Shake Milton understands the flow of the offense and is willing to play both on and off the ball in a much more consistent way. We talked about how he's better catch and shoot. He's better above the break. He's also very comfortable playing off the ball and both catching and shooting and also cutting. He can also operate in ball screens himself as the ball handler. He could do some of the things that Jaylen Nowell did. But this true usage rate shows that he can be a cog in the machine, which I mean that in a very good way, because if you're not Anthony Edwards or Karl-Anthony Towns or Rudy Gobert, it's effectively what you are. I mean, like, some are more important and bigger cogs than others, like a Kyle Anderson. The Wolves were relying on Jaylen Nowell to be a significant part of their success last year, and he was not. Now the Timberwolves can say, hey, we think we know what we have in Nickeil Alexander-Walker. We're adding two guys who were on playoff teams last year and successful playoff teams in Troy Brown Jr. and Shake Milton. They both were cogs in their respective machines and played a role. We think they're more prepared to do that than Jaylen Nowell was last season. And this true usage statistic is one, it's again, one number. And I always want to be careful just picking one number. And that's why I kind of saved it for last. Like, I don't want this whole argument to be built around true usage. But I think it's illuminating. I think it shows us essentially what the Wolves are trying to capture here. Or maybe a better way to say that is it captures what the Wolves are trying to do is find a player they can slot into this 9th man, 8th man role and say, hey, we want the offense to continue operating with you on the floor as it did with the starters. We want you to run the offense for 2 to 3 to 4 minutes on a given night, and then Ant's going to come in and you're going to play off the ball. And that's something that Jaylen Nowell was never really comfortable with, and Shake Milton absolutely should be. And when he's on the floor, the Wolves should have a better offense than when Jaylen Nowell was on the floor last year. Despite the overall offensive impact number for Jaylen Nowell or the grade being better at people index, I think Shake Milton has a greater and more positive impact because if you dig a layer deeper, as the Wolves front office is no doubt doing, the actual shot profile fits better. The actual decision-making fits better. All of those things fit what the Wolves already have better than what Jaylen Nowell did, and that's why the Wolves ultimately made this move. Thursday show, as I mentioned earlier, I want to talk about a few of these key characteristics across the board for the newcomers, for Shake, for Troy Brown Jr., and Nickeil Alexander-Walker, who, again, I usually use the term newcomer for Alexander-Walker. But what are the key qualities that the Wolves searched for in deciding to sign and re-sign those players that they're replacing in Taurean Prince, Jaylen Nowell, Jordan McLaughlin in the rotation? What are those key qualities overall, overarching, and why the Wolves are doing it? So we'll do that on Thursday's show. That's all we have for you today. A big thank you for listening, for making Locked On Wolves your first listen every day. Of course, this show is free and available everywhere, including YouTube, as well as all of your favorite audio platforms. You can also watch the show on the Locked On Sports Minnesota app on Roku and Amazon Fire TV. You can follow on Twitter at Locked On T-Wolves and at Beecken with 2 B's, 2 E's, CKEN. Of course, the Locked On Wolves podcast is part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Remember, the Locked On Network is your local experts on all the biggest stories. Once again, I'm Ben Beecken. This is the Locked On Wolves podcast, and we'll catch you next time.